Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dushko Petrovich, and I'm here to cut off all your conversations. Sorry, it's my job. Welcome, everybody. We have a really exciting grand finale, the season finale tonight with Pradeep Dalal, who's come all the way from Mumbai via New York. So that's very exciting. And to introduce him, we have Julieta Chung.
Hello? Hello, okay, so hi everyone. So following the program's custom of reading a poem at the beginning of the introduction, I've chosen one by Emily Dickinson. I saw no way the heavens were stitched. I felt the columns close. The earth reversed her hemispheres. I touched the universe. And back it slid, and I alone, a speck upon a ball, went out upon circumference, beyond the dip of bell. So I have this deep honor, thank you, everyone in the program, of introducing tonight's speaker, Pradeep Dalal. While Pradeep and I hadn't met in person until just moments ago, his work gives me the sense of having been in the process of relating to him and thus reflecting on my own ways of relating. In discussing Pradeep's practice and his project, Bhopal MP, the curator Shanae Javeri remarks that the sense of intimacy in Pradeep's work never veers into the confessional in a creative process of sharing that is generative and productive. I note the use of the word sharing that echoes how I feel when I encounter Pradeep's art and writing, that I've been extended an open invitation to one artist's personal journeys. But when I say journey, it's hardly a linear process, as the returns and advances within his work allow me to both behold and step into his world and the one he negotiates. The artist Nancy Davenport says it best when she describes Pradeep's work as an, quote, encounter between two different types of records and two different experiences. To open out into the personal and the impersonal, proximity and distance, withdrawal and disclosure. I appreciate this quality of trust in me, his viewer, to engage with him in a deeply personal dialogue about history, memory, the diasporic experience, and cultural inheritance. Pradeep's work, let me see, okay. Pradeep is a Mumbai-born artist and writer based in New York. His work has been shown at Oakville Galleries, Toronto, Art Cake in Brooklyn, EFA Project Space in New York, Kalikun Fine Arts, New York, Sala Diaz, San Antonio, Texas, and Murray Guy in New York, among other venues. His photographs have been included in Blind Spot, Bomb, Cabinet, Grey Room, Nueve Lutz, and Rethinking Marxism. He co-authored the artist book Photography in the Sensorium from 2021. His artist book Bhopal MP was excerpted in Chandigarh is in India from 2016. His essay Hand and Loom was published in Wolf Tones, Soberscove Press, and Dalal co-chaired the photography department in the MFA program at Bard College, Annandale and Hudson in New York from 2015 to 2020. He has also taught at Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the International Center of Photography. He directs the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant in New York. I feel that we are very fortunate to be exposed to Pradeep's generosity. It is that heartfelt desire to connect that I feel, and that comes through in his work. And I and all of us in the Low Residency program look forward to being in conversation with you, Pradeep, tonight and in the coming days. Thank you for joining us, and let's a warm welcome.
Thank you, Julieta. Thank you, everyone. I just want to say good evening, and I really want to thank the program, the LORES MFA program, Greg Bordowitz and John Neff, and Dushko for inviting me to come here with you guys today. I've followed this program since the program began, and it's been very close, and we've had many friends and colleagues who have come and taught here and been visiting artists here. So I've heard great things in this kind of feedback loop from Nancy Shaver and from Zoe Leonard and others over the years. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. So thank you again. Also, I've worked with Claire Warden, the MFA student, as a mentor, program mentor, this last whole year, and it's been terrific. So it's given me some sense of the program just from seeing her work and hearing her speak about it. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of a background. I'll just say that when I was an architecture student in India in the 80s, I had come to Chicago and worked in an architecture firm in Lincoln Park for 4 or 5 months. Chicago was the first American city I ever lived in. This was a long time back. A quick biographical sketch just to say that I was born in Mumbai. I studied architecture in Ahmedabad and then came to the US to go to graduate school in architecture and urban design. So I practiced and worked in research and architecture for many years before kind of going back to art school and getting an MFA. So that switch was kind of quite fundamental to kind of leave architecture, didn't ever practice it again. But I found that in my projects, photography and art, that I've found myself able to kind of navigate architecture and ask the questions that I always wanted to but could never in practice. So it's funny how these things work sometimes. I'll say that my interests in photography and art and work are primarily focused on India, and somehow when I turned to art, the connection and the need to kind of make projects in India became paramount. And I found myself wanting to explore and really work on projects there. Now, I say this just to preface that, again, I've been here for more than 30 years in America. But right during COVID, I had to switch up and move back to Mumbai to help care for an elderly parent. And so the last 2.5 years I've been based there and working from there. And I found that that has been a really important kind of a thing, both to be able to make work there, but also to be situated outside of America and looking back at America from a completely another geopolitical space. And it's been invaluable. So both at the level of just understanding how the world works, how America is seen from other parts of the world, but also in making work with a different set of economic measures. So in fact, in recent shows, I've just kind of made work very simply, not using a fancy photo lab, kind of just learning to kind of make work at scales that I could ship and courier for shows here, all of that. So hopefully I'll have a sense of sharing that with you. So for today, what I've done is I'm going to just show you a couple of projects. I'm going to show you a few projects that I've done while I've been here. And they're not chronological, but I'll explain them. And then I'm going to end with 2 projects that I've done with the collaborative group with Nancy Shaver and others with Wolf Tones, one at Art Cake in Brooklyn and one in Canada. So that'll give you kind of one sense of how I'm working. Oops, sorry, what's happening here? Nope. It's not moving on, sorry. Just check. Yeah. Sorry, it was doing it before. No, it was working fine. Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, thank you. So this is an opening image I'm just going to start with, and I'll close with this image, and I'll explain it later. But I wanted to start with an earlier project I did just a set of photographs in Mumbai. Now, this is a panoramic image of the bay in the heart of Mumbai, this kind of U-turn bay. And I used a 19th century photograph, which was done in two kind of large format glass plate negatives as the bays. And then within that, I've kind of inserted these interruptions and then done something on this side, which you will see, where I kind of mirror what you see on the bay on the opposite side, and it's a contemporary view. So it was just like playing with this idea. And this location is obviously no longer like this. I mean, now there are tall buildings everywhere and it's completely built up, but the bay remains. But I wanted to kind of work with something that was deeply inscribed. And here, all the years in school, like we lived on this side and I would go to school on the other side. So there were 2 trips every day for a dozen years. And I still continue to make those trips. So I just wanted to kind of work a little bit with that. And I'm just including it here just to give you a sense of how. No, it is in the middle. No, that's a detail. Oh, the cursor. Exactly. Right. Sorry. I should take it down. Okay. Is that good now? Okay. So these are, just as a process, I was making a lot of work where I'm kind of reusing photographs, bringing other images in play, but they were all done on the flatbed of a scanner, not in Photoshop. They're all done in that first pass of the scanner. So things are moved and shifted in that. And it became something that I was like really playing with a lot and enjoying. Okay. I'm going to move on to one other project, but before that, I just wanted to read something that there is a writer called A.K. Ramanujan that many of you may know. He used to teach at the University of Chicago, and he's a wonderful, wonderful poet, translator, folklorist, and linguist. And he taught for more than 30 years at the University of Chicago in South Asian languages, in linguistics, in anthropology, and other departments. But I've been going back to his writing over the many years, trying to kind of make sense again of how he articulates these positions. And here is something that I keep going back to. It's just a little excerpt from an interview that he did. He says, "Self-conscious, we write out of a corner of ourselves, filtering out our childhood, our obscenities, our bodies, our mythologies, the rich fabric of illusion that a first language is. You don't just write with a language, you write with all you have." So he says, "When I write in Kannada, I'd like all my English, Tamil, etc., other languages, to be at the back of it. And when I write in English, I hope that my Tamil and Kannada, like my linguistics and anthropology, what I know of America and India, are at the back of it. So it's, of course, only a hope, not a claim." So it's a wonderful way, like I also think of operating. I mean, I grew up with 3 languages in India, and then how we learn to compartmentalize different things that we do. For me, it was architecture, art, other things. And here is a constant kind of gauntlet of trying to kind of push yourself hard to try and get all the elements in play. Okay. So here is, again, a project called Measure. It's related to an architectural temple site in South India, a 12th century temple. So when I was a student in architecture school, I had visited and documented many historic architectural and archaeological sites in India. But this one in particular is a 12th century temple where for a couple of weeks we had to sit and measure all of those structures that you see in the plan and then redraw them when we went back to the school. And I was really interested after many years, what happens if that process of drawing, measuring, does that kind of instill something in your memory, or does it just fade away? So I was kind of curious about that, and I started to I revisited this site. And one of the things I was trying to do was to find every form of documentation on this particular temple in South India. So there were architectural guides, there were archaeological studies, there were historical accounts, there were even temple promotional literature. And I inserted my photographs within that. You'll see the plan at the bottom, on the left there. And I was just trying to kind of see what part of that experience stayed and what had not. I also made a set of images from that. And here I was trying something where this is a view out of my parents' home in Mumbai. And what I was like really after is that when I'm in Mumbai, are elements of my experience of the temple staying with me in my mind? And while I'm in the temple, do I completely dissociate from this childhood home? I've lived there for like 30 years, my parents have. And is that a separate part of me? So I was just trying that little exercise of allowing these two things to kind of fold within themselves. So you'll see elements from the temple on the side or the corner, the columns. And similarly in here, you have the street views and then again, these markers on the ground at the temple. And this is like a fragment of, these are like figures that are carved in stone on the temple floor that are prompts to pilgrims to lie down, prostrate, and pray. So I was interested in how kind of pedagogical the temple can be too. But I think for me, what was happening in here, and then I was also interested that my images don't stay only within an art context. Here they took that image and used it for the cover of this book on urbanism and cities in South Asia. But I wanted to say one other thing, which is that, we've learned, and I learned in architecture school to like really look at plans, sections, elevations, and you're like constructing the building in your mind from all of these data points. And I realized that for architecture like this, which is very old, the roof, the actual physical encounter feels very dated. It doesn't feel contemporary. But that slight bit of learning I had when I spent time at the temple many years later, not when I measured it, but later when I went, is that actually the form of the temple completes not in the documentation, but it is in the usage. That as pilgrims walk through the temple, walk through those buildings, the space actually comes alive and is legible. So that was a very interesting thing, that comparing it to contemporary modern architecture, these buildings, which may not seem that modern and contemporary, are actually spatially, as you walk through them, phenomenally so. And that was fantastic, because part of what my exercise has been is to kind of go back to look at things that I disregarded, didn't pay attention to, or looked down on when I was a student there, and to kind of start to learn to see for myself what might be actually encountered or worked with. Of course, it's not only me. I mean, I'm reading things and I'm coming across other people who have also encountered and done this journey. And for many of my projects, I was always interested in kind of trying to break the rectangle of the photograph, wanting to see what happens if it is carried in your pocket, that it can curve on the body, that it can have a different presence on the page, or how it's encountered. Yeah, okay. Now to a recent project, a more recent project. I had a residency at the Elizabeth Foundation and started to make work there. A few years ago, there was a wonderful exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum looking at early 17th century painting in India. And I found myself like really drawn to these paintings, especially the paintings that were part of manuscript pages. And one of those artists was this person called Mansoor, who was a great, what they called, illuminator, and that he made exquisitely detailed border decorations with, plants and flowers and intricate patterns of birds and animals. So I looked at these paintings and see that is one of the joys of being able to live in New York. I could hop onto the bus, get to the Met, and I can see these paintings by a whole slew of these fantastic painters from the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. They just have them in the gallery. If I'm living in Mumbai right now, I can barely see one if I go to the main museum in Mumbai. Maybe if I go to Delhi, I can see a few more. So what I began with was I made copies of these Mughal manuscript pages, especially these Unwan compositions, and of calligraphy and borders on tracing paper, and found myself drawn to the geometrical elements, these asymmetrical rhythmic placements. You'll see little bits of it, but this is not the right thing. Now, what I was doing was I also Xeroxed some of these pages to encourage a kind of blurring and softening of all the fussy detail. As you know from miniature painting, people just like rave about the single hairbrush and this absolute finesse and precision and elegance. And I was trying to see what happens when I start to take some of that away. So I was interested in seeing what a lo-fi graphite gray image of the original gold and jewel-like paintings would look like. I noticed how the rectilinear elements, the crisp geometry of lines, could effortlessly hold their own with the foliate plant forms. And this bringing together of abstraction and nature for these artists was a very intrinsic and matter-of-fact thing, which for me became a revelation. So I just will show, these are like some studies I made, but again, made on the scanner. I think for all of you that are printmakers, this is pretty basic. But I was taking a class with a very fine teacher at the Manhattan Graphics Workshop, just doing engraving, and found it, of course, immensely hard after photography to kind of like really do something physically with your hand. But I wanted to say that I then made modest prints by inking these etched copper plates and marveled at how the vegetal patterns registered in shallow relief on the fine art paper. And then I scanned these prints and printed the photographs. Another kind of image emerged, one with a condensation of detail, less delicate and stranger than the original. And I also mixed etching inks and was struck by how the colors of my prints, the rich umber and ochre browns and pale yellows, translated into digital photographs. So I selected these 5 images, which I separated from one border manuscript by Mir Ali, and then I centered them. And so there was a process of extraction and then distillation to see how the smallest marginal units of these compositions may hold. So this will give you a little detail. Physically, the prints, even at 8 by 10 and 11 by 14, are like extremely beautiful, the color and the way that they actually read. And I wanted to just say that the process was like I would nudge the process along step by step. So I'd make a photograph, print it, make a Xerox copy of it, heat transfer the image onto a copper plate, ink the plate, run it through an etching press, and print on wet paper. I like that relief, three-dimensionality of the image and the way the ink sits on the paper. I like the vibrancy of the pigments and the immense possibilities of transformation of color by mixing etching inks and oil. So the softness of the image, the diffused edge of the lines, were the opposite of what I would look for in printing a photograph. I mean, I would never actually go for this. And yet I kept thinking that this is another form of clarity and then another displacement. So I scanned the prints and I reworked them digitally, matching and approximating the pigment hues in Photoshop, and then outputting it as an inkjet print. So it's kind of weird, after all of that desire for the printmaking process, in the end, I kind of went back to a photograph. I think along the same time, I was also making another project, also at the Elizabeth Foundation, and that had to do with a small garden that I stumbled on in Srirangam. This is like one of the most historic towns, which is made of like layers of concentric temple kind of units. And I just stumbled on this garden, which was just outside the temple walls. So initially, I was drawn to its casually decrepit, forlorn, and unkempt quality, very different from the highly choreographed and strictly ritualized order of the temple precincts. I did not photograph there on my first 2 visits, and my first 2 visits were over like 10 years. And then on the third visit, so maybe a dozen or 13, 14 years later, I did take pictures. And this is, funny enough, this is called Coronation Park, and they have the statue of the Queen, and all the Tamil tradespeople in the market coughed up the money to build a statue. And see, they have marigold flower garlands and stuff. It's pretty wild to actually just think of that whole process, though. Now, while I was making in the park and making these images, what was happening was that they were trying to save on electricity, so they kept shutting the lights off. So I was sitting in the dark just with the trees full of birds, and it was like a stunning kind of experience to be there. And I tried to photograph, and obviously my images were like really blurred. So I set aside these images and said that they were useless. But then I went back to them several years later, and I really liked this kind of sense of this kind of shards of glass kind of coming down from the sky kind of thing. So I included them in the grouping. So it's interesting sometimes how you put things aside thinking that they never did turn out, but then you can kind of work with them and continue to think about those images. But I was also interested in Queen Victoria and this park. They were celebrating her proclamation as the Empress of India in 1877. And at that time, the British introduced the Indian Penal Code, which contained the notorious Section 377, making sexual activities against the order of nature illegal. So after 150 years, it was finally overturned in 2018. And I was wondering, what does it mean in terms of the order of nature? Who decides what belongs to nature and what falls outside of it? So I've always been interested that sometimes very personal, small things can connect to other histories. This little park in Tiruchirappalli could actually connect you to kind of these weird colonial legacies that people are living with. So this is an interesting thing. Around that time, Fia Backstrom, who's a colleague of mine at Bard and a wonderful artist, and I were asked to do a project which was through Pratt Institute. Shannon Ebner, the chair of the program, had developed a series of these essay booklets, and they're called Pounds Per Inch, and they were published by their MFA program. So Shannon's the editor of the series and the chair of the photography program, and she did the first one with Rhea Anastas. Fia and I did the second one, and Leslie Hewitt did the third one. She had planned that they would do 6 of these little booklets and then stopped that. And her explanation for the idea behind it is kind of really interesting. She says, every generation shoulders the weight of an image inheritance, images that appear to be without gravity in substance, but not in matter. But images can also be property, objects of great contestation, and also hopefully renewal. Who cares for images? Who's watching over them? Who cares for the impact they have on our lives and what they show us and tell us about living in the world and about the things we look away from but must see? Beautiful. And why ask these questions alone when you can ask them in public, where they can go to work on the next generation of image makers and thinkers in the halls of the places that we call school? End quote. Sophia and I co-authored this essay, Photography in the Sensorium, and it's derived from a symposium that Pratt had called Teaching Photographs that both Fia and I did a workshop. And we were invited to respond to pedagogical questions that Shannon had put out, saying, how do photographs teach? how do photographs perform, how are photographs made. So we spoke about our own ways of making work, and both from our experience of teaching at Bard and kind of our own processes of making. Now, so we did this project, and I'll give you a couple of spreads from it. So again, the work that I showed you earlier kind of reformatted. Fia and I both got 2 pages of a double spread in the booklet. And we, again, combined these images, and it was kind of fun to kind of tilt the Queen's statue upside down. It was fun to kind of see these pictures. And you'll see the formatting. Fia and my paragraphs kind of intertwined, like we just wove them in, and we had images and prompts for thinking and questions in the margins. It's a small little booklet. Again, I've asked them to actually, Dancing Foxes, to send them to your library, so you should get them. Now, I felt that I've not put my own making process under this level of scrutiny before. In making this book and writing and thinking and discussing the text and images so rigorously and so collaboratively made me worry that the heightened self-consciousness would mess with the pleasure of making and thinking more unguardedly. But then I read this little sentence by artist Lorraine O'Grady, where she says, and I'm quoting, "The process of explaining the work has helped me understand it. You get the benefit of other minds, and it's made me realize how artists who are not attended to lose the opportunities to grow." So it's like an interesting observation, you know, like it isn't just promotion per self, but it is in this kind of feedback loop or a way of thinking about it. Now, also when we were thinking about what we were doing in here, so this was the other thing. So what you see at the underlay is actually a plan of the city of Srirangam, on which these pictures of the park and the park benches have overlaid. Now, both Fia and I are making work in and about our home countries, Sweden for Fia and India for me. So there's an aspect in our work of translating cultural context, particular histories that may not be fully legible in the US. It's true for Sweden too, and for me. So there is a density of materials that we cover in this little booklet: photographic processes, printing techniques, art history, institutional and national histories, artist writings, and literature in this phrase that this wonderful Indian writer, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, says, the multilingual imagination. So a whole range of voices are brought in from many disciplines: architecture, philosophy, linguistics, literature, political history, and more. And the writing ranges from the plain spoken and diaristic, descriptive, informational, and even ruminative, and also questioning and uncertain in places. The images also work across these registers, from the thumbnails that serve as references to images and process studies, to installations, to maps and diagrams, and perversely, as tiny memos to the final full-scaled works. And the double pages allow for a more visceral encounter with the images and in color. I'm still surprised that a little booklet like this is able to pack in so much, even though it comes across as light and unassuming. It's like a really interesting lesson for all of us to kind of keep in mind that it isn't a bound monograph published by a big house that is going to like really land. Okay. I threw in this project to show you. It was at a small show at Callicoon Fine Arts, and it was curated by Moira Davey and Jason Simon. It was called Compassionate Protocols, after her Vegebate's photograph project. Now, I'll just go through them quickly. Now, I won't use my writing, but I'll just say how Moira and Jason wrote this text. They said, the Samagri series features haunting totemic head-like forms in black and white, camera-less images, produced solely by maneuvering an object on a scanner, using only crumpled newspaper. Let's see, that was it, yeah. newspaper, formerly the wrappings of small votive Hindu icons transported from India. That the photographer subtly scrubs the material in real time across the scanner bed with its slowly descending light beam. Simultaneously figurative and abstract, the newsprint forms float in the sea of deep black open spaces above the scanner and uncannily evoke the presence of the objects they once served to protect. So in this process, the artist befriends chance and accident, bringing to mind the surrealist photography like Brassai's sculptures Involuntaries and J. Boyfard's The Big Toe. I just wanted to say one thing, that obviously the objects don't look like this. It's like creating sculpture on the scanner. They don't look quite like this at all. But I'm using the form and moving them on the scanner again in real time to kind of produce these shapes. So it was kind of an interesting thing. They don't exist excepting in the image, and they don't exist in real life like that. A couple of months later, there was this little exhibition called Museum Without Building by this French architect, Jonas Friedman, who was well known for mobile architecture and the idea of space frames and entire cities being built out of extremely mobile units. And they asked me to kind of to include some work in here. So I'm just showing you a couple of install shots. And these blue space framey-like structures, these tessellated forms, are part of Jonas Friedman's kind of structural device. Now, they asked me to contribute, and I mean, I don't make work like an Jonas Friedman thing, but what I found when I was looking was that Friedman actually worked a lot in India, and he had transported back to his house a huge amount of Indian materials. So there were like textiles, toys, drawings, dolls, masks, paintings, and they covered every available surface of his studio. A playful riot of color and texture, densely layered with study forms of geometrical grids, corrugated forms, and hoop assemblages. So in my mind, my little ruse was that I was imagining that the newspaper wrappings from that Samagri series may have ferried these objects to Friedman from India to Paris, and they easily took up residence in his home. So that was my little kind of a thing. But it was fun to kind of make them just on these cardboard boxes, tape the photographs directly onto them, and then they inserted them into the installation. I was in India then. I just mailed the stuff there. Okay. So now I'm going to just shift gears to a project that began. Now, when I moved to India 3 years ago, just a little before that, I was asked by, actually, let me back up 1 second. I was asked by Nancy to participate in the book that Julia Klein and Soberskov published on the work of wolf tones, and I contributed that essay that many of you have in your reader called Hand in Loom. And so I was very focused on textiles in there, and I used my, okay, maybe I'll come to this in a second, but I'll give you a glimpse of it. Yeah. So I had that rapport with Nancy around textiles, and she was very encouraging for me to write that essay for Julia's book. And then from that essay, very organically, she just said, okay, she had been asked to do a show in Canada. Would I develop some ideas and see if anything sticks? Now, I want to just go back for a minute to say that right from the beginning, from the first projects I did in grad school, I'd always incorporated textiles as a backdrop and part of the images, but without being conscious of it. I just did it from things that I grew up with or had in my apartment. And then in 2013, I was invited to do a small show at Franklin Street Works in Stamford, Connecticut. And I wanted at that time, when I did that show, to think about knowledge or learning not available in a library nor contained in books. I decided to make images purely on tactile manipulation, no composing per se, just a set of moves with bits of fabric and small objects, folding, bunching, brushing, shifting, squeezing, spreading, sliding, swiping, pinching, molding, swirling, twisting, and fanning on a scanner glass bed. And it was a great thing. I mean, it was like really interesting. And some of those images are in that Wolfstone's essay, Hand and Loom, at the end. But in trying to understand what I was kind of doing by working with textiles and objects, I revisited this beautiful essay by Annie Albers that most of you should know called Tactile Sensibility, and was so thrilled by it that I included it in the show. I mean, I just Xeroxed it and just put a grid of the lecture, of the talk, and I gave it as a handout to anyone who came in the gallery. So here are a few sentences from that essay. She says, "We touch the things to assure ourselves of reality. We touch the objects of our love. We touch the things we form. Our tactile experiences are elemental. If we reduce their range, as we do when we reduce the necessity to form things ourselves, we grow lopsided. We're apt today to overcharge our gray matter with words and pictures, that is, with material already transposed into a certain key, pre-formulated material, and to fall short in providing for a stimulus that may touch off our creative impulse, such as unformed material in the rough." Now, I mean, she wrote this in the 60s and 70s, and it's, I keep going back to it to kind of remind myself. And here is Annie Albers again. It's the term that I used for the start of the talk. Matière is the word now usually understood to mean the surface appearance of material, such as grain, roughness, or smoothness, dullness, or gloss, qualities of appearance that can be observed by touch and are consequently not concerned with lightness or darkness. So matière, she says, is mainly non-functional, non-utilitarian, and like color, it cannot be experienced intellectually. It has to be approached just like color, non-analytically, receptively. So it's kind of interesting, like how the more we have moved into this other realm, there is the sense of what could be lost as part of that process. Now, I mean, of course, to try and understand textiles, there was another piece simultaneously that I was also reading, and it was this essay by Ty Smith in Grey Room, which again, if you guys don't know it, seek it out. I mean, it was later published in a book. It's called Limits of the Tactile and the Optical, Bauhaus Fabric in the Frame of Photography. And here she relates the ideas of tactility very directly to photography. She looks at the impact of Moholy-Nagy, his ideas of tactility, on those of his student, Otti Berger, and frames this with the thinking of the art historian Alois Riegel. And so here are two observations that deal with this, just as I'm trying to kind of think about it, but that point to the interdependence between the optical and the tactile modes. So in her touch panels, Otti Berger reminds the viewer that touch is used with vision and vice versa. One must grasp the structure not only with one's brain, but also feel it out with the subconscious. On Berger's theory, she says, her tactile capability applied not only to the physical, but also to the psychical sense of touch. Now, in Alois Riegel, who's looking at it historically across a large span of time, his account of the shifting modes of perception and production from ancient Greece to the Greek, classical to the late Roman period, he outlines a clear progression from the haptic to the optical. But the path, he says, towards the optical Kunstwollen, it's a German term, but it means the will to form, its active nature through which art becomes not an imitation of reality, but the expression of a desired reality. And it's marked by the battle that leaves the winner with the repressed memory of the other. So while the optical perception takes the privileged position in his account, in Riegel's account, Riegel recognizes the degree to which these terms always collide. Regal says that he lays out an opposition between the two sensory modes to show that they are interdependent aspects of perception, that they aren't separate. Okay, sorry for the long preamble, but so hence this kind of like obsession with textiles, and it's just been deepening the time I've been in India. And now Nancy Shaver, who I mentioned, who asked me to be a part of these two projects with her and her collaborators, Sterrett Smith and Maximilian Goldfarb, she loves textiles, and they're a very large part of her sculptural works. You guys saw her presentation last year and must have encountered her work. But she also, as you know, her kind of day job and way of surviving is this phenomenal store in Hudson called Henry, where she has phenomenal textiles. And, you know, all the artists I know from Bard and elsewhere in Hudson, from David Hammonds to Zoe Leonard, all of them shop there because they're looking at Nancy's eye to look at the things that she lands on and finds these incredible things. And they're not always kind of high art or high pedigree, you know, it's just her eye and noticing things. Nancy's told me once, and I guess it's common knowledge for all of you too, that she used to go flea market shopping and thrift shopping with Walker Evans. So it's kind of incredible how they developed the eye. Now, so she'd asked me to contribute an essay for this book that Julia has published, and we began just in this very inorganic way. They just asked me to be there on meetings. I was in India. The three of them, that is Max, Nancy, and Sterrett, are upstate New York. And we began to do studio visits, actually, just every month, sometimes more often. And we just started to talk about work and encourage each other and just look at it and get reactions without like a real sense of what that might be. I've never worked like that. I've worked very solitary, kind of on my own, and then reluctant to put the work out there. But this was a very different mode of operating. And I'll give you one kind of an exchange that I had with Nancy. This is via email. So here's Nancy saying, Pradeep, I love how the structures will begin to take over. Any chance of these sometimes being printed on muslin for drapery/clothesline? So then I reply saying, thanks, Nancy, for the suggestion of printing some of these on muslin. I've never done that before and had not considered it. Great idea. We'll see what I can test out here in Mumbai. And then Nancy writes back saying, also the muslin could be folded images in with the textiles, bricks and measure. So it's this nature of this exchange, but I found it phenomenal to kind of like really try a bunch of things, and they're in this show. So while we began to work on the show for Canada that Nancy was invited for, this opportunity came up to do a show at Art Cake, this space in Brooklyn. And we began to work, and I just shipped stuff. I couldn't make it for the installation. So Nancy, Max, and Sterrett kind of installed the show. And I'll just walk you through some of the slides. It's a pretty wild show. And I think a lot of these things, the lessons are slowly kind of being eked out. And here are some of my photographs that are on these weird clamp devices that Nancy's partner kind of devised. So they're on clamps with little holders on these rods that then are part of quilt stands. I've never shown photographs like that, and they're kind of just floating in air and in your peripheral vision. Then I also made these images, which are large 30 by 40 on transparencies, and they are draped on these quilt stands or they are pinned. Again, very unusual ways to kind of put work. What was terrific about the show is that there were 20 other artists along with the four of us. No checklist, no citation, no recognition of who made what and where. It's a pretty interesting way to work. And just look at the density of it. It's kind of pretty breathtaking. And so this is like one of my images, and I'll show you what I was doing. But what was incredible is like how you see through the image to other sculptural objects, and color and other forms start to kind of come through. And at the scale of it, it's pretty incredible. Here, see the close-up. Now, these are all human beings. that are flouting COVID lockdown conventions and gathering for a ritual. And here are the newspaper clippings. Now, I was in India during the lockdowns and they were ferocious. And I was taking pictures with my phone from newspapers and just sending them to friends to say, like, wow, this is the situation here. COVID curbs being trampled upon in an overcrowded market on Wednesday. Now, the reality of the economic situation is not everybody was having food delivered at home, and they had to kind of go out and deal. So there were other things in there, but then that image was like that. And then here is a night market, another market, and people are desperate to get provisions for their families. Not a mask in sight. And I was like really paying attention to these images, but I wasn't thinking of it as work or a project or anything. I was just really noticing how the newspapers were reporting it. And then slowly it found a way back into the work. Now here you see how the work is, and you'll see that cluster on the left, and then my images are just scattered through, but then there is stuff from Nancy's collections of textiles, there is paintings, there are drawings, there are her blockers, there's all kinds of stuff. And part of their approach is that you basically break down the defenses of the viewer. So you're not being told that this is an important image, this is less important, this is this is that. And you just start to kind of sink or swim. You have to kind of make sense of it for yourself or leave in defeat, you know. And it was, they asked me, like, do you have any protocol? Because I just shipped the work to them in a couple of boxes, some of it mounted. And I was really appreciative of Nancy telling me to make prints that were 9 by 13, which is the same size as her drawings and other work. So my work is kind of alongside her blockers, the other pictures are mine, and things are mixed in, but the scale matters a lot. Like, and I've really enjoyed making work at a very small scale just to see how that's Nancy and Max kind of installing. And those are like a lot of them, that cluster is my photograph, but then they just move into all these other things. And I was also trying to kind of understand, what does it mean for my images to be in this flow? Like, what does it mean for my images to be like that image that you see there? It's of a weaving tool, and it's just below that plaid, black and white blocker of Nancy's. So how are you making sense? I think subconsciously you're registering the textures, you're registering the materials, you're registering a lot of things. And you can see what an installation. I mean, they were there for a week installing, phenomenal amount of time and effort. And there's no like real plan. Now, the underlying idea or a notion was that, you know, from the title that you remember is the kind of the idea of a river. And the river kind of just moves through that space. And on this wall, which is facing that, is a blank wall where they just painted a long rectangle of Yves Klein blue and left it in that abstract sense. So the space was divided in two under this. And here I'm just showing you some close-ups of the images. And what I ended up doing in this time in India was the sari is embroidered by my mother. So my mother is like 95 now. But as a child on, she learned to sew and stitch and embroider. And I slowly found, in spending time in Bombay, that she has a huge amount of these saris that she, her sister, and her mother would embroider. They would get the patterns done. They would make the pattern on the dining table, take 9 yards of this fabric to a printer. They would print the pattern on, and then my mother would embroider. And she would tell me to like look at the reverse of the embroidery to like really look at how fine the stitches were. So I was kind of like taking images of the reverse of the embroidery too. And I was also able to look, now she can't almost wear saris, but this is a sari that her mother gave her that was acquired at the ashram where Mahatma Gandhi was teaching and working, and where they were actually growing khadi and making these khadi textiles. So this is the one thing that I was just like absolutely thrilled to get hold of. But just look at, this is like the most modest in an ashram if they were acquiring these saris, but just look at the geometrical order. So what I was really after in looking at these textiles is to try and understand a line, a grid, but when it's woven, the geometry moves differently. There is a kind of softness to it, and the experience of that line is so different from one that's drawn or is embroidered. This is a sari of hers from, and then I was taking these images of, again, you can see the grid within that square. I was also looking at images of tools for weaving, and these tools are also so basic, and then you can produce saris like this out of very basic handmade tools, like looms that are made like that. So it's been like a fantastic way to kind of really learn about textiles and weaving, because again, India is, that's been like an incredible part of its history. Here, this is again that image that I'd shown you before, but again, I'm experimenting and rephotographing a Xerox and photographing it with textiles also, so to kind of keep that play on going. This is another of those kind of images. Again, the rectangle of the image starts to curve in, and you get a kind of a different form. And again, what is on the edges of the image is also another level of textile. So there's this odd correlation between the scale of a city with all these towers, the scale of the landscape, and then the embroidered, handmade thing. And just look at how, this is like a double ikat weave, but look at what happens at the edges of that. It's woven, and it's pretty kind of incredible to understand how we think of a square or a rectangle as a form. And in the woven, of course, this is magnified, but you get that blurring and the softness of the edge lines. Here too, that entire thing on those lines on the left are all in the weaving itself. Okay, and then some of this work then went to the show in Canada, which was a very different animal, because it was in a house museum, and there were 4 rooms. It wasn't one large space. And all 4 of us, each of the 4 of us got a room, and then we borrowed work from each other. We helped each other out in putting the work together. So this was like one wall in my room, or in the space that I had. But again, like you see those paisley blockers of Nancy's, and they just abut, and she just said, just put them right next to the image and see what happens. The other things at the bottom left, the blue velvet with the green are hers, the black thing is hers, the top right-hand one is hers. So this kind of back and forth was like super interesting to do. The other thing that also this exchange allowed me to take more latitude, what you're seeing, these brown framed photographs, are found photographs that I found on the street in Mumbai, and they are of wall paintings in a small village in India where the motifs are very similar motifs to those that are woven and embroidered. It was interesting to just put them in play, but I highlighted them and framed them, whereas all my work is just pinned to the wall. But see how we use these shelves, and one of the things on all 4 rooms, the shelves kind of go through and become this binding device. And they carry these pinned pictures. That picture on the left is of it's a Gandhian thing, but it was to learn how to produce yarn or thread out of cotton. And that was my mother's toolbox. It's like 80 years old. But she learned to kind of use that, and I was able to photograph it. Yeah. So that's across that wall, and here is an installation. That white funnel shape is Gret's. That log cabin quilt on the floor is Nancy's. There are other fabric. And the desk structures which hold the transparencies are from Max. And then that city view that you saw there is also clamped onto that pole, and it just becomes this textile that folds. You see there. That brick is Max's. It's from upstate New York, brick kiln that does them, called Empire. And then what you see, the red cloth at the bottom left there, that is a special cloth that is woven only with permission from a temple in Orissa, where they actually weave script. So they're like actually sentences from an important kind of the Gita Govinda. But those forms are just fantastic. I still have to do more work with that, but here I was able to just get hold of one of those things and we put that in play. This white sari there is my mother's embroidery with the flower tendrils. And here is, this is also an important lesson from Nancy and the others, is it's just placed on this African cloth. Not to kind of finesse it, it's not framed, it's not done anything. Just the process of even just placing can be powerful. And just look at the color combinations, this black and white kind of grid on that African cloth. This is a double image, but again, that idea of the clamped image, there are like two images back to back, and now that same image is on the top left in black and white. So there are a lot of things are repeated in color, black and white, inverted, not inverted, scale changes. And I included, these are photo album pictures of my mother and her mother, my grandmother and her, from a trip they'd made in the 50s, sorry. And here. And I wanted to kind of get at a sense of the clothes as they're worn. I mean, it's one thing to fold them, put them on the floor, put them on the wall, put them whatever. But what happens when they are actually part of the body? That's my mother on the right there. But again, I mean, they could be dipped in water, but fully clothed in sari, so the level of modesty and decorum is kind of just incredible. But I wanted to kind of get a sense of that history as well. This is that thing that she learned. It's a little wooden box like that, but she's kept it. And this is Nancy's room. And so you see how this just pile up. All of these little white structures are like cast clay by Sterrett. A lot of these are found textiles of Nancy's. And some of them were fantastic, that she would have these little, they could be raggedy, but they would be 16th century textiles. I mean, from Syria and from other parts of the world. Oh, sorry. No, don't worry about it. Okay. Yeah. And then what I really liked is what you're seeing, that tool image on cloth that's folded over there. There's something about the twinning of a tool to weave on a kind of a support tool. There's something odd about it, but I kind of really liked how it was working. And some of my textiles there with the text are included in there. But this process that looks very casual is extremely meticulous in the placement. And that was pretty incredible because this was the first kind of real install that I worked with Nancy on. So we kept moving and patting things and straightening things. So even though it has this quality, but even the patterns and what is next to each other is like really considered very carefully. And at the back, you'll see how the wall, the one on the right is in Gret's room, the one on the left is in Nancy's room. So that becomes like a little spine that goes through. This is like looking at the other side of that tool thing. And I printed these in Bombay on flag material. So they actually print flags with them. But on black and white, they actually look great though. And here are these color things are Nancy's blockers. And there are sculptures and other objects there on the shelf. And those images on the top are mine. They're taken from one of the most important books on textiles, where they cut up hundreds of saris to give you these actual swatches in the book. And I was really interested in how they were very, very economical with the use of these swatches. So there'd be a sliver of a rectangle or a little square, but then there'd be a black and white photograph or a drawing to kind of replicate how the rest of the sari would look. So I was interested in that black and white and color. And the actual, when you see it close up and you see the texture of the cloth, you can just understand how visceral that feeling is. These scribble drawings are Nancy's, and this is in her room on the other wall. That little blue image at the bottom is a oldest known example in India of woven cloth. It's a shawl with a trefoil pattern. It's 5,000 years old, and it's in a little statue that is in the museum in Delhi. And the book on the right is my mother's book where she writes in very fine print. They're like little things. And these, again, I put them on cloth. For sleepless nights, there's just like one little phrase that's just repeated in this book over and over, and there are hundreds of books like this that she's written. Okay. So I can stop here. Should we take questions? I have other stuff to show, but we can maybe. It's a lot. Thank you.
Hi. I think your photography was absolutely brilliant, especially the abstract part. And your textiles were also really interesting and creative and how you use them to create art. And I'm just really fascinated with your work, and I'm wondering what your future plans are.
This time, I mean, this group, Wolf Tones, with Nancy and Brett and Max, they've added one or two other people. And they're doing a show in Buffalo in October. So we've begun to make new material for that. But for me, these are prompts. I'm making work in India, and I think one of the things that I wanted to say is that over the years, but I think these last couple of years in India, I found myself wanting to work very close in. I don't want to work in archives, I don't want to work in museums or in historical kind of documents. I want to work with things that belong within my own family and in the closer circle. And I think there's something to that. So I've been kind of discovering all of these things from my mother and from my aunts, from my grandmother, and kind of trying to kind of make work with that material. But without it, I mean, I'm using autobiographical materials, but it's not about her or them per se. It is like I want to connect it to other things, I mean, or other kind of history. One model for me is this British artist Ingrid Pollard. I don't know if any of you guys know her work. She did this fantastic project that I used to show my students a lot called Oceans Apart. And she grew up in Guyana, in the West Indies, and her father left her when she was very young and her mother to earn a living in England. And she begins this project by putting two, I mean, she has the letters the father written, their childhood pictures of the beach in Guyana and all of that. But she then situates them in this incredible way. She has a letter from the father saying that he's trying to look for another job so he can earn, 20 pence more or whatever per hour and do all of these things. And then she brings in a letter that was written to the Spanish crown looking at how they're prospecting in the West Indies, looking for more gold and treasures. And so you just see the scale and the way they're both talking about money, but they're both kind of operating on these very different registers. And when I saw that project, I thought, wow, I mean, here is one person whose father went to work in the UK, but it attaches onto this whole history of the Windrush and the movement of people from the Caribbean to the UK and back. So something that could be just particular and ordinary for her became this thing that she was able to very deftly, it's not heavy-handed, Doesn't make a lot of artwork on it. But just these two letters are enough to kind of completely understand the scale of greed. It's a beautiful project.
One thing I really appreciate in your work is this kind of double quality whereby the photograph seems to bring us closer to the thing, because somehow the scanning is a closeness that we're not used to, or even with our eyes, we don't get that closeness. But then it's also kind of, for lack of a better term, objectified or frozen in time and kind of presented somewhat, I don't want to say neutrally, but kind of, that has a kind of documentary affect. So I don't know, and I've just been buzzing with like how that relates to a kind of diasporic experience of like the closeness or the sort of indescribable closeness. I was just thinking, I think more about foods than textiles, but it was like a kind of, there's a level of like recognition with a food that's been distanced from you from so long, or I don't know, but I just was wondering if you could kind of riff on how that works for you in the photography, and I don't know when you got to the scanning, was it a kind of like eureka moment of figuring out that you could kind of get both things from the scanning?
I think I think like almost like the early projects I did were very much around that. I was interested in a couple of things. One, that there is a longer span of time in the picture, so that it's not just what is in front of my lens that is in the image, but there are other things. And so that's one. The other was I was always after a, less visible in this work, but a much more denser image. I wasn't interested in, here are 6 pictures that are part of my series on X, and you allow those 6 pictures to kind of construct something for you. That can happen too, but I wanted it within that rectangle, that a crazy amount of density is built right in. And I tried a lot, and I wanted that image to kind of meld and move into another image, or move into another portion. I'll show you one later work. Bear with me for a second. It's an older project that I did. It's this one on a old site, again another 5,000-year-old site, archaeological site. Here I was very much trying to kind of break and double up these images, see how they're cutting and folding within that. And it's not photoshopped at all. It is exactly in that cut of the thing. But again, how the rectangles bleed. And then again, the kids are exactly at the location where the figure is in the archaeological photograph. So there is a little bit of that. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have 2 questions, if that's okay. So one, I'm very curious about your mother's writing. I couldn't understand what she wrote. Obviously, I couldn't understand. But I'm curious if she wrote also about the time of embroidery, like if the space for her or that time of while she was embroidering, if that appears in the notes, about the affect and how did she feel when she was doing this, or what kind of activity embroidery was. Just kind of, I'm curious about the experience of the women that are embroidering, not just the embroiderers' rings themselves. And the second question for me, it's kind of, if you see a relationship between the wall, the architectural wall or the architectural structure, but maybe particularly about the walls and the folding of materials. And because like, or what does it mean to fold all these textiles, or is it kind of a pliable plane, something that Penelope Curtis writes about, in the relationship between,
Yeah. No, that's, I think, The underlying question is a very important one about women's stories. And I think this time that I've spent with my mother, I realized the way we grew up in India, everything was kind of modeled or patterned on the male members of the family. So if I studied architecture, my father was an engineer, I never thought that I could do something that my aunt did as a thing. But in spending time with them, slowly these things are pulled out from in these conversations. But they were never conscious, like my mother did it just as a very matter-of-fact thing. I mean, they were the things that they made, and all of them were good at it, and they really enjoyed it. She still talks about getting certificates of merit in school for embroidery and being told to teach other girls in the class and stuff like that. So I think it's only now, in my questions and my wanting to photograph it, that it has become a little more, she's aware. And I think she's thinking about what it means to kind of, what will happen to all of those, her saris and her embroideries when she's gone. Will anybody care, or will they all just go be sold off or given away? But I think the point that you're raising about the women is also true for weavers. Like, I can find a fair amount of knowledge on the weaving process from government institutions, from weaving centers, but from the weavers themselves, oral interviews and women weaving with the men, all of that is very limited, very difficult to get hold of. You have to kind of piece it together, because they're not trying to do it. But I have photographed, and I'm paying attention to some textiles that are made in the northeast of India. They're made on a strap loom and by the women for the village and for their families. So they don't wear anything from outside, not store-bought. Everything is woven by the woman. And she weaves her own trousseau for her marriage as well. It's all women, and the men don't weave in that community. Again, India is very varied, so I can't generalize. Like, one tradition may not hold true in another part of India, too. Yeah. And did I miss the second question you want to tell?
The question was if you see a connection between like the architectural structures or the walls themselves and the folding of the textiles. What are the textiles in relationship to the architecture?
I think less.
Structure
Right.
also.
I think less so in contemporary architecture, but when that 12th century temple that I photographed, they have these beautiful molded walls that you can lean against, and they're like fantastic, so you can run your hands and your whole body can kind of rest on that. All of that's gone in contemporary architecture. There is no material in that detail. But I'm paying attention to it kind of retroactively, the weaving's taking me to that. And it's the same thing that there are weavers' centers that were set up in the 70s in India, but many fine artists who, India didn't until very recently have an art market or an art world. So the finest artists never survived on their art. But many of them worked for these weavers' centers, and they would draw patterns and textile designs for the weavers. And now, because there is an art market, all of the stuff is coming out, and you can see the impact of weaving traditions on their own artwork. So the same patterns, borders, details, motifs kind of echo back in the paintings, which were not recognized before. It's only now when they're paying attention to that work. Thank you.
Hi. I have very excited about this work, and Irina almost stole my question, because I too was going to relate the architecture with the textile, but moving through the photographs. And it strikes me the way that you were speaking to the temple that you were photographing in an earlier project about a kind of enlivened space, that there was a way in which the use of the space enlivened a dynamic of the architecture. And so I'm not thinking about that necessarily as patina, like a way that touch might patina the architecture so much as the way that it affects the space that's around it. And it strikes me that your approach to photography, while it's moving into a flattened image space, the way that you're working with it on the scanner bed or the layering is creating an enlivened space between the images, a kind of a full or swollen space that's happening where the rubbing up of those images together create another kind of dynamic. And so leading on into the question of the textiles and or the photographing of the textiles by having folds or relaxed or pulls or a way that a corner might fold. There's a way that you're thinking about a form of it feels to me that you're equating a kind of enlivened space with the architectonics that you're producing in the images with the textiles on backwards through the photographs, the scanner bed, and then back to an architectural position. And that's my, like what I'm noticing, but I'm wondering if you're interested in sort of thinking that through right now.
That is interesting. I wasn't really conscious of making that connection. I think that 12th century temple, for me, it was learning to look at things and noticing a really beautiful aspect to that architecture, which we always thought was not that interesting. So it was like learning to kind of notice it. And it comes from both photographing it is the excuse that allows me to be there, but in that also to notice that there are these elements within that architecture that I have to learn. My teachers, when I studied architecture, themselves had a broken connection with historical past. I mean, they'd all studied in the UK or in the US, many of them, but the models were very much, they themselves didn't have a textured relationship to India's past. And they were trying. And I think I was in that mode where, at that time, we were also just looking towards the West and not so much our own traditions. But now, of course, things have changed and there is more and more that's available. But that is really interesting. I hadn't kind of thought that some of these elements in these photographs is coming from the textile work, and it could be. But time-wise, I mean, I did this long before. I mean, you know, this is a dozen years, 15 years ago. And sometimes these projects come back. Like when I made this project, for example, on this archaeological site, it was from a grant, and they totally didn't like the work, so I never showed it. And many years later, when they published it in that Rethinking Marxism as an Artist portfolio, it became kind of interesting to see it in the pages of a book, alongside with a text that I had written for it. So I think sometimes these things have to find the right location and form and time. It doesn't always work in the original iteration. But I will think about that more because I think even in my writing, I have spoken about what it means to kind of caress those cornices that are part of the temple and what does it actually mean. But I never kind of activated that beyond that.
Hi, I'm curious about your process regarding criteria that you use to present photography in the positive versus the negative.
I've always liked the negative image, but just on my, just as a kind of orientation in a way. But in this work here, when I'm using the negative, it is to kind of bring out the diagram of the weaving. So in my mother's embroidery with the pattern becomes legible in a very different way in the invert. But then so in a way, a lot of these things and having it in the room is a bit of a bricolage. That you see it in black and white, you're seeing it in color and understanding color in a particular way with the pattern or a form. Then you see it in a negative form, and the geometry just suddenly plays up in a particular way. But you have to assemble it, because you can't quite see it all in one, say, perfect color image alone. But then the pattern is a balancing act between the design and the, like even in the grid pattern with the squares, there are ones with blue and red squares. Like once you look at that, you're not paying attention to exactly how the borders are actually drawn. So I found it helpful. And I don't use it for everything, I just use it in some ways. Yeah, very rarely. Yeah, I have done it, yeah. Like in this one here, it's never been published as a photograph, but I only use it for in the publication. But again, there is a story and the title. Now, the father of archaeology in India, this guy, Mortimer Wheeler, he had a direction where they used Indian natives to provide scale in these archaeological sites. And he writes in that direction that you are never to look at the camera, you're always to be in profile, often crouched down, and he says, you're only so many feet of bone and muscle, which is kind of an extraordinary thing to say. So a lot of what, in repetition of these figures has been very much around the idea of looking back at the person photographing. Not all of it is articulated, but anyway, that was the reasoning in there.
Thank you so much. Incredible work. I'm over here.
Yeah.
Hi. My question, I guess, is sort of dovetailing with Irina and Kelly around this idea of the phenomenological, the activation. I was really struck by what you were mentioning in terms of the form of the space being legible through the pilgrim's usage and movement. And then talking about within the temple, these spaces where the body can rest, and perhaps thinking about that through, you talked about caressing cornices, and even the language of it is so, it's very sensual and synesthetic. And so it's making me think a lot about, for instance, a mosque in Fouta Djallon region in West Africa that is built out of thatch, but the basis of it, if you move through it, is based on the hatumere, which is the magic square. So that by moving, which is also embroidered in textile, but then by moving through the mosque, you are actually activating the sacred symbol and performing that in the space. And so I'm just thinking a lot about that. Your work has really moved me in that way in terms of how, I guess my question is how you think about that in terms of installation individually, and your statement about moving closer rather than outward in future, and when you're working also with others in terms of that installation process and what you as the artist are experiencing, akin perhaps to thinking even as the artist residency as a kind of a pilgrimage perhaps, and then also how you're imagining your audiences and those who experience it. Maybe you've answered this already, but it's just something that I'm it's really moving me in your work, so.
Thank you. I think to your question of the kind of sacred square and how it's activated by the bodies, it's an insight that I had when I was at that temple and understanding it. And even in this temple, as in the plan, you move only in one direction. You can't go the other way. So there are rituals around these. I think part of it was also when you're dealing with ancient architecture, I think in America what happens, or in the West, it's so much of the contemporary and the modern alone. But I know Many years back, I was visiting a temple with my mother in a part of India, and she could be in the temple in that mental frame and come out of the temple and buy bangles. So the idea of the sacred is not, it's stitched in with your life in a particular way, much more organically than how we may know how to do it now, without fear of losing something in the process, that it is always with you. So I think for the pilgrims, it is something, again, similar. But for me, it was a way that in education, in architecture school, the first exercises I did in a small city in India, in Ahmedabad, were from the Bauhaus. We did grid drawings, and we did this kind of diagramming, patterning, measuring, drawing. All of those are kind of frames which you have to find ways around. And they're not that easy to get around, because they become so much part of your thinking. So these are like little attempts to kind of push against that, to be able to notice. And once you do notice, then you understand the idea of the bricolage. Like in the little text I'd written around that temple, it's also the colors of those columns. They're like, I mentioned deep red and a brown. Now that brown is related to the coconut that you use in the temple. It's related to the areca nut, So the echoes are all around, but you can't get it from an architectural textbook. You're not going to get it. But you have to stay really alert and notice, and slowly these little observations may build a head of steam. I'm not sure, but so I think that is kind of one piece. The other part that you also mentioned is also a challenge for, I think when I've collaborated with Fia on the essay, it was very pointed. I've known her, we've lived together in the summers at Bard, we've taught together for many years. But yet, her approach to the world is quite different from mine. And any collaborative exercise, there are all of these points. So for example, when you saw that image of Nancy and Max installing the work, so I would question, like at that point, is it purely pattern? Is it purely form? Is it purely composition? For me, none of those images are purely form or composition. But at one level, I learn, and I think it is extremely freeing to be able to take away the associations and to allow the formal language to be in play, and maybe that way it'll get under your skin in a way that your brain would short-circuit it. So I think these are trade-offs, and you have to learn to live with these trade-offs. But I'm very conscious of that. I think my sense of the world is that I wouldn't pick examples so easily from Brazil or here or there without having some kind of associational context. But I value the ability of other artists to say that, hey, I'm going to write about this, or I'm going to make work about this place. So I come from a country that has just such a deep historical press with so much tradition baked in that these things feel terrific, like a breath of fresh air in a way. But you have to be very conscious of what it means, because culturally these things, the pressure points where you're coming from makes a huge difference in how you interact with the material.
Hi. This might be a short question. Have you read Roberto Colosso's Ka?
I haven't, but
Okay.
I should.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then that's.
But he's a very interesting person.
Well, no, because he brings up a point here that I was going to ask you about, but it's
No, but
okay.
please bring it up. Let's see.
Okay. He says but are you familiar with his work?
A little bit.
A little bit. So he says women's work and knowledge is different than the Vedic knowledge. So I just wondered if you had a response to that, given the genders, the work of the women that you're focusing on, and so many images of men.
Yeah. I don't know it in the sacred text the way he's bringing it up. Like, I don't operate with it in that way. Or I haven't. But I think these histories are being rewritten now, like more and more, both the historical texts. For example, I attended a talk in Mumbai recently where there's a historian looking at the Sanchi Stupa, which is this early Buddhist site, and finding out that there was actually a queen who hired the British to restore that stupa. So it was the woman who actually hired these high-ranking British officials in India, paid them money from her wealth to actually restore an Indian. Fantastic. But these things are not written in because they're just not part of the larger documentation. But it's slowly happening. And I think for me, it is these conversations with my mother and an aunt and other things which is giving me a little bit more of a sense, and it's untidy, it's difficult, it's violent. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff within the family that is related to how the women were treated and what exactly they had to do. So I think, I don't know exactly how to think and what to do with it, but it is startling because these are hidden histories that are just not part of the family lore at all. But I visited an aunt of mine just as she was passing away, and she had these incredible things to say. She sold her jewelry to pay for the cremation for her husband. So there are all kinds of sacrifices that have been made, but that are not part of, at least, the male members of the families. I mean, the women may be sharing these stories and may have an understanding of it, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.